Most lifters know that intensity is important for getting stronger. After all, there are very specific adaptations that come from higher intensity, but high intensity could mean high absolute load, in other words, high percentage of 1 rep max, which we know is important, but also high relative intensity, as in high RPE or a close proximity to failure. But the question is high RPE necessary for powerlifting? In this video, I will go through everything that you need to know about having high RPE in your training, how to know how high is high enough and not high enough, and more important considerations to make outside of RPE. Now, if you wait to the end, I will show you how I apply these ideas in this video to help me peak this 120 kilo lifter without going heavier than 83% and RPE 6 in his training. Let's start with what we actually mean by high RPE. RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion, and it's typically measured on a scale from 1 to 10. So for example, at RPE 10, you've basically got no reps left in the tank and it's true failure. And at RPE 9.5, you can't do another rep, but you can add a little bit more weight. At RPE 9, you've got one more rep left in the tank. At RPE 8, you've got about 2 reps left in the tank, so on and so forth. So when we say high RPE, we're talking about training very close to failure, usually at RPE 7 and above. Now, it's important to understand RPE in the broader context of intensity. Fundamentally, RPE is just a lens, a language for describing how hard a set is relative to your maximum ability within a set. It's one of several ways we can prescribe and quantify intensity. Prescribing RPE can be a more subjective counterpart to percentage-based training. However, it's more than that. Every RPE value for a given rep range actually corresponds closely to a certain percentage of your 1 rep max. For example, a set of 5 at RPE 8 might roughly equate to about 80-81% of your 1 rep max. So whether you're prescribing a load as 5 reps at 80% or 5 reps at RPE 8, you're essentially talking about the same stimulus just from 2 different angles. And so that's the key point. If you prescribe a certain percentage based on your estimated 1 rep max on any given day, you'll end up performing a set at a corresponding RPE or a certain number of reps in reserve. There's simply different tools for managing and expressing training intensity. So before we even debate whether high RPE is necessary, we first need to remember that it's not a magic number. It's just one way to describe how close to failure you're training and the intensity of the absolute load. And so when you combine an RPE to a rep range of a set, it's just how you are distributing the absolute load. So it's not surprising that most powerlifters believe that high RPE training is important. After all, the principle of specificity tells us that what we do in training should replicate what we do in competition to a degree. And in competition, you're not performing sets of 8 or 10 reps with plenty of reps left in the tank. You're performing a single maximal attempt on a squat, bench, and deadlift. And that's a 1 rep max of a true RPE 10 effort. Also, competition performance isn't just about muscular strength. It's about the skill and psychological readiness. You need a high enough psychological arousal, essentially being amped up enough, as it can help you express that muscular performance. And the thing is, less experienced lifters will often have a harder time committing and staying with reps that are close to failure. That's why training close to failure can actually offer that benefit and actually serve a purpose, because grinding through heavy loads at high RPEs teaches lifters to commit to a certain lift even when it feels difficult. It builds a lot of confidence under high loads or fatigue, and it helps the athlete develop the ability to stay composed even when a bar speed slows down a lot. There's also the practical benefit towards monitoring as well, because high RPE set gives you a more accurate way to estimate your 1 rep max on any given day, and that's valuable data for tracking progress over time. So all of these reasons, the mental rehearsal, the technical replication, and the data tracking, makes perfect sense. There's nothing controversial about why powerlifters may think that high RPE matters or is useful. But as we'll see later on, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to train that way to get stronger. So let's talk about what's wrong with high RPE. Now, while high RPE training has its place, there are definitely trade-offs. It's not a free lunch. The biggest cost for most lifters is fatigue. When you consistently push close to failure, especially across multiple sets or lifts, you generate a relatively larger amount of acute and medium-term fatigue. Acute fatigue is basically what you feel after a hard set. It impacts the bar speed, technical consistency, and potentially even your ability to perform in your next set. You've probably experienced this. After a brutal top set, every subsequent set feels slower, heavier, and sloppier. Medium-term fatigue occurs as the consequence and impacts over days or even weeks. When higher RPE sessions pass a certain threshold, you start to see the costs, namely regressions in performance. It's also not just through fatigue performance, but the need to overcompensate for recovery, leading to an overall reduced rate of stimulus. This kind of fatigue doesn't just affect your physical output, it also blunts technical skill development as well. Now, depending on you or your lifter's technical proficiency at high intensities, training at high enough RPEs may bring out some form breakdown. Fortunately, this may mean that you're essentially practicing your lifts under conditions of technical breakdown, which can reinforce bad habits. For example, if during higher levels of RPE, your knees tend to shoot back and you tend to be a little bit hingier in a squat, you can actually reinforce that by repeating that too much. Also, if your sessions are high enough RPE, you may end up needing to reduce your training frequency, which impacts technical skill development as well. So yes, high RPE can build commitment to reps and competition readiness, but the trade-off is recovery. And if fatigue outweighs the adaptation, progress ultimately slows down, which is not what we want. But before you jump into any conclusions, long-term progress isn't just about optimizing for reducing fatigue. We most certainly do want to train hard. On top of that, a certain high RPE may be fatiguing for one lifter, but another lifter may be able to tolerate multiple sets of it without evidence of reduced performance. This is what I often refer to as fatigability of RPE. Key things like managing volume and intensity properly and using deloads at the right time are part and parcel with pushing exposure to high RPEs at certain times to help pace progress. So the right question isn't, should I train hard with high RPEs? It's, what are appropriate levels of RPEs over time? In other words, how high of an RPE is necessary and how much exposure to high RPE is appropriate. So let's talk about how high is high enough. So if high RPE comes with trade-offs, the question becomes, how high is high enough? Over the medium to long term, you want to train hard enough to create meaningful adaptations, but not so hard that your fatigue starts digging you into a recovery hole. So let's break this down. First, there's acute fatigue, as we mentioned before, that short-term tiredness that builds up within the session. If your RPE is relatively too high early on, you can tank your total volume of your remaining sets. For example, if you push your top set to an RPE 9.5 or 10, the following back off set can suffer depending on the lifter and the lift. So in order to preserve the intensity, you may have to reduce the working set load even more. If your average intensity ramps up too much from sticking to a certain load, you may risk passing a recoverable level of intensity, which depending on where you are in your microcycle or mesocycle may be too much. Then there's medium-term fatigue, the accumulation of stress across multiple sessions or weeks. Even if you recover fine from one hard day, repeatedly training at very high RPEs can limit how much total work you can handle over time. And in powerlifting, total productive work, basically the tonnage that you can actually adapt from, is important for long-term sustained progress. So the sweet spot is this. You want RPEs that are high enough to give you meaningful exposure to absolute intensity, i.e. percentage of 1 rep max, but not so high that they compromise the amount of quality work that you do afterwards, especially early on or in the middle of a mesocycle. And even if you do include those all-out sets, it just needs to be strategically balanced with rest of the working sets and training sessions. The key is controlling how frequently you expose yourself to that level of effort so that you don't lower the overall ceiling of training that you can recover from and adapt to. In short, high RPE has its place, but only when it's applied intelligently. So let's talk about what matters more than high RPE. At this point, it's worth asking a real question. Is high RPE actually the thing that drives strength gains, or is it something else doing the heavy lifting? Pun not intended. So here's the truth. For powerlifters, the load on a barbell, basically the absolute intensity, matters more than how close you get to failure. In other words, training with a high percentage of your 1 rep max is relatively more important for strength than simply pushing sets to RPE 9 or 10. Proximity to failure, basically your relative intensity, RPE, affects fatigue and effort, but it doesn't drastically change the strength stimulus when total work is equated. Research often shows that when total training volume, that sets, reps, and load, or total tonnage, is matched, training to failure doesn't necessarily produce superior strength gains. Instead, it tends to have a larger effect on muscle hypertrophy, that is muscular size, whilst offering no clear advantage for maximal strength. A great example comes from a 2025 study by Robertson and colleagues. They ran an 8-week experiment with trained men, splitting them into 4 groups. One group has 4 to 6 reps in reserve, another had 1 to 3 reps in reserve, a third group trained between 0 to 3 reps left in reserve, and a final group trained every set to failure. And their results showed that the groups trained with 4 to 6 RIR or 1 to 3 RIR led to similar strength gains, while the groups training all the way to failure actually saw slightly worse outcomes. So what's the takeaway? Well, you don't actually need to chase high RPEs to get stronger. What's more important is having that high absolute intensity exposure, i.e. percentage of 1 RM. When it comes to thinking about how we prescribe intensity, quite often it may be worth spreading out the high absolute intensity over more sets and avoiding that proximity to failure. For example, instead of doing a set of 4 at RPE 9, it may be, depending on the person and the situation, it may be better to do 2 sets of 2 at RPE 7 instead. Another idea to also keep in mind is that athletes' response to RPE may differ between the lifts too. So let's go through a real life example of someone that I've coached recently. So this is Percy Kovic. He's a 120 kilo lifter. In the first block of training that we started off with a very conservative level of volume intensity. Now let's focus a little bit more on his squat. So for his squat, he has 2 sets of 8 at RPE 4 on his secondary day and 2 sets of 6 at RPE 4 and 5 respectively in those 2 sets. And that's his primary day. We basically progressed this RPE very gradually from week to week. And in the third week, we added an extra set of 3 at RPE 5 just to conservatively increase his top end intensity exposure. And by the 4th and final week, before his performance started crashing, the secondary day was 2 sets at 8 at RPE 6 and his primary day was 2 sets of 6 at RPE 5 and 6 respectively. And his top set was a triple at RPE 6, which even though it moved incredibly fast and submaximally, it provided a lot of fatigue, which was evident in his accessories showing reduced performance and his subsequent training days as well. And we basically leveraged this observation to help him design a peak and taper that allows him to have exposure to top end intensity without overly fatiguing him. In his peak and taper, we converted that triple into a double and a single and capped the single at RPE 5, which in training ended up being 272.5 kilos. And in the competition, he ended up squatting 325 kilos, which wasn't necessarily his competition best for him, but was self-reported to be the fastest he has ever moved that weight. He was confident that he had a bit more left in the tank in that 325 kilos. But if we assume that 325 kilos was his 1 rep max, then 272.5 kilos was about 83% of his 1 rep max. Now, if we address the elephant in the room, there's obviously the important question being, if you only expose a lifter to such low RPEs and percentages, how can you project where someone's 1 rep max is and what their temp selection should be? In the context of Percy, it's important to understand that he is a relatively more experienced lifter, and we were able to tell what sort of percentage of 1 rep max load this was based on previous experiences of warming up and competing. And this was also a situation where we only had 9 weeks before we competed in our first competition together. And in future scenarios, there is absolutely opportunities to explore slightly higher levels of intensity loads and RPEs as well. Knowing how sensitive he is to intensity, we may have to reduce the frequency of this type of exposure and use deloads and linear periodization, where we reduce the volume to manage the fatigue when we do expose him to higher levels of RPE. And I hope you guys found this video useful. And if you guys want to check out more stuff from me, there is a free community in the description box below. And as always, click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.